Churches have become whorehouses. That heading was derived from the title of an article in a conservative Lutheran newspaper. This was the actual title: "The American Church is a Whorehouse." Well, when I first saw that title, I thought it was both vulgar and harsh. But then as I read that article and some of the others that were dealing with the same subject, I began to agree, and that is sad. The truth is, I had been trying to deal with what I had been seeing for years. I want to present several Bible passages first. Christians can do. Now, flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. What? Know ye not that your body is a temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. That's 1 Corinthians 6:18-20. And if you'll notice there, that the Holy Ghost and God are both in us, and they're both God. Marriage is honorable and all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. That's Hebrews 13:4. That's Paul, and here he is again. Don't let sexual sin, perversion of any kind, or greed even be mentioned among you. That is not appropriate behavior for God's holy people. It is not right that dirty stories, foolish talk, or obscene jokes should be mentioned among you either. Instead, give thanks to God. You know very well that no person who is involved in sexual sin, perversion, or greed, which means worshiping wealth, can have any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. That's Ephesians 5:3-5, and that's in the God's Word version. I became an altar boy when I was 11. My mother took me to a church where the previous father had been moved on to some other church because he had become involved with several young boys. Then I began attending a Pentecostal church with my dad, and in a couple of years, while still married to my mother, he began dating a woman, and I and one of her daughters held hands in the back seat, and she soon became my stepsister. Now, there's something wrong with that picture. There were several other shaky marriage situations in that fellowship. That reminds me of some of the deacons, board members, and ushers I have known. Scary. The following are a few of the weird things I saw in fellowships on down through my life. I remember 2 pastors that I was around who had cheated on their wives more than once, but that did not hinder their ministries. 2 other pastors in a fellowship ran off with their church's piano player. 3 other ministers molested young girls. In one case, where the leader of a Christian school and the pastor did not want to turn a guy in, and in the meeting dealing with that, I was told they liked the way it was going before I stood up. I tried to present that girl's case. The previous speaker, who was also a pastor, had just said they should just sweep it under the rug. But that was why I had stood up to speak. Nothing was done by those leaders, so a little later I finally called the sheriff. There was a problem. for they were relatives. But even then I should have left that church, but did not, and I have paid and paid for that. I used to record sermons for a church. That was in a church that, in a sense, I was married to. I used to love some of the messages I heard preached, but many of them made me sick. All of this got my attention, and I began studying church history and get into the Bible more. After all, I had been a youth leader and a Sunday school teacher, and even had a prayer meeting going a couple of times. Then as more time passed, I saw teenagers that had went to Bible school come back almost skeptics, but well trained in building a church. I saw some get divorces, and the leader of that Bible school had girl problems. Some other pastors had held homosexuals up before the people who were preachers or musicians, and one was a crook. I finally began to get more of a backbone, but by then a lot of damage had been done to people and also to my relationship with them. Well, they had dealt with that leader of that Bible school, and I remember them dealing with some of the other men that were wayward like that and immoral. But they didn't even miss one service. A lot of times they just kept right on preaching, and they hushed it up as best they could. I had questioned several doctrines for a long time. When I was a teenager, one of my grandfathers passed away, but I remember looking through several of his books on prophecy and quickly saw that those writers did not agree with each other. He was a Schofieldite or a dispensationalist, and as time went on, I heard of a Jew who was well educated in ancient languages, who thought if he translated the book of Revelation, it would be a good financial investment, since his being a Jew would impress Christians. But he made a mistake. He said in public that the book of Revelation was about first century history, and I am sure that undermined his idea. But I never forgot those things. But my studies created more problems. Here's why. I became convinced that I had been brainwashed into believing Christ was yet to return, but began to see he had kept his word. In John 14, he had told his followers the world would never see him anymore. He is obviously speaking of them not accepting his return when it did happen, and would be because of their willful ignorance and spiritual blindness. When I saw that, I realized that I too had also been willfully ignorant and spiritually blind. He had even explained that to the woman at the well, and said from then on, worship in Jerusalem or on that mountain in Samaria would no longer be accepted by God. He clearly told her that we are to worship him in spirit, for God is a spirit. That tied John chapters 3, 4, 14, and 17 to the day of Pentecost. And that was the first installment on his return on that day. The completion of that day, or the full end of that age, all happened within 40 years. The rejection of Christ's first century return is further proof that American churches are into whoredom. You ask why? Well, here's the problem. Most of them do not believe what Christ said about his soon return happening in that generation, which is approximately 40 years. They immediately mention, no one knows the day nor the hour. But that is at best a 24-hour period, not 40 years. Christians must either believe what he said or they are following something other than Christ. And if that is the case, they are then unfaithful to him and are into spiritual fornication. To see Christ's kingdom and to enter it is a choice and has to do with having a spiritual birth by faith. That's in John 3. Remember Nicodemus? Now, Abel did not lose his spiritual relationship with God, and we can be reborn and become spiritual beings. Then we become walking in the Spirit and become dead to our flesh. God offered that to Cain, but he rejected it. You remember Paul saying that he beat his body into subjection? In chapter 7 of Romans, he talks about when we were in the flesh, past tense. That's where we used to be before we committed our lives to Christ. The Trinity Broadcasting Network has undermined Christ's teachings. Most of my friends, if not all, do not accept what I see, but their fellowships are supporting TBN either by ignoring its wickedness or catering to it, and it has been efficient in putting them to sleep. The founders of TBN were ordained in a huge Pentecostal organization, and the history I talked about in the beginning here of this presentation fits both TBN and most all of Pentecost and all of the other fellowships my people are now involved in. They are being taught to support Israel, even to the point of nuking nations for Israel, and are taught that Talmudists and or Israelis are God's chosen people. That is an act of pure spiritual idolatry and whoredom. TBN's leaders have been exposed in newspapers for being immoral and greedy, and they support Israel and continue war. War is the lucrative racket. You know, very few people even know what the Talmud's all about. Why is that? Well, Netanyahu over there said that the laws of Israel are based on the Talmud. You ought to check it out and see what it says about you. Guess how many of my friends and relatives have sat down with me to discuss this? I do not remember one. Neither have any preachers ever taken the time to discuss these topics with me, even though my wife has went to church without me for 20 plus years. I have actually been shunned. And in one case, that was supposedly because I offended a person, but I was not given the opportunity to explain myself. And what I had said is in keeping with what is going on all over the world and was true of all of our past relatives for centuries in every Muslim nation. They think the United States people, and the women especially, are whores, and all those Muslims, man, they really come down on us hard over there. I have had presentations on YouTube for several years. I do not remember of very many of my own friends or relatives ever commenting on them. However, I've had numbers of compliments and profitable conversations with people on the web and with neighbors down through the years. Like David said, is there not a cause? Well, this presentation is supposed to be an exposé, educational, and a warning. I have had a very good life, and I have been blessed, but I still hurt for my people and for the children, especially those in the Middle East. I'm not kidding you, that really gets my attention. This is the end of this presentation. Thank you for checking it out.